On December 23, 1987, 20-year-old Janet Brochu was enjoying a night out with friends when her evening took an unfortunate turn. While her friends were permitted entry into T. Woody's bar, Janet, who was just under the legal drinking age, was asked to leave. A man she had met earlier offered her a ride home, but after she became ill in the parking lot, he refused to let her into his vehicle. The events that followed Janet's departure remained a mystery for over 30 years until the identity of the individual responsible for her tragic fate was finally uncovered. Disturbingly, he was also linked to other incidents. Janet Brochu was raised in Winslow, a quaint town in Maine, along the Kennebec River, which had a population of approximately 8,000 during the 1980s. It was a peaceful community, ideal for raising children. Adopted by Geraldine and Albert Brochu as a young child, Janet grew into a vibrant young adult, managing her diabetes with diligence. She required regular insulin but was responsible in her health management, which may have influenced her decision to pursue a career in healthcare. By late 1987, she was employed as a dietary assistant at Maine General Medical Center, Seton Campus. However, on that December evening, her job was the last thing on her mind. With college on break, it was the perfect opportunity to reconnect with high school friends whom she seldom saw. Their evening began at a local bowling alley in Waterville, just a short distance from Winslow. After enjoying some time bowling, they engaged in conversation with two men in the adjacent lane, and the group decided to continue their night together at T. Woody's restaurant and bar, located on the lower level of the Waterville concourse, offering a lovely view of the river. Upon their arrival, Janet was denied entry. The legal drinking age in Maine had recently been raised to 21, and unfortunately, Janet had just missed that threshold. Her friends, all of legal age, were eager to continue their evening. As the only one unable to join them, Janet found herself in need of a ride home. Fortunately, one of the men they had met at the bowling alley offered to help. The subsequent events are somewhat unclear, but certain details are known. Janet had left her purse inside T. Woody's, and the man who was meant to drive her home went back to retrieve it, likely because Janet was not permitted to re-enter. Upon his return to the parking lot, he found Janet unwell. This could have been due to her earlier drinking or possibly related to her diabetes, or even something she had eaten that did not agree with her. The man then decided against allowing her into his car, concerned about her condition. Shortly thereafter, she disappeared. The following morning, Janet's parents discovered she was missing. After unsuccessfully checking with her friends to see if she had stayed over, Geraldine and Albert reported her as missing. A comprehensive search was initiated, and news of Janet's disappearance spread across the nation. Investigators diligently pursued every lead, regardless of its origin, and even explored the possibility of tracking insulin sales linked to Janet's condition. Regrettably, despite their efforts, they were unable to make any significant progress. Days turned into weeks, and Janet remained unaccounted for, as if she had simply vanished. Her family clung to the hope that she would eventually be found safe. Each day, her disappearance was filled with anguish as they held on to the hope that the police would deliver good news. Unfortunately, those hopes were shattered less than 3 months later. A call finally came, but it was the one no parent ever wishes to receive. In the early hours of March 18, 1988, a man inspecting his hydropower station at the Waverly Avenue Dam made a grim discovery. He found an unclothed body floating in the Sebasticook River. He promptly alerted the authorities, who arrived shortly thereafter. The area was secured, and a preliminary search was conducted along the riverbank for any potential evidence. The body was transported to the coroner's office for examination and identification, where it was confirmed to be Janet Brochu. The initial autopsy did not determine the cause of her death, but it was established that she had not been alive for long after her last sighting at T. Woody's. In the weeks that followed, a specialized dive team was deployed to the Sebasticook River to search for any of Janet's belongings or clues regarding her fate in the hours after she was last seen. Investigators were still considering the possibility that Janet may have accidentally fallen into the river that night. The Kennebec and Sebasticook rivers converged not far from T. Woody's, and it was cold and dark when she was last seen in the parking lot. It is conceivable that Janet attempted to walk home and slipped into the icy waters while crossing the bridge back to Winslow, unable to escape before succumbing to hypothermia. However, a significant issue with this theory arose: the absence of clothing on her body when discovered. It seemed improbable that the river's current could have completely stripped her of her clothing that night. Moreover, it was crucial to note that Janet's body was found upstream in the river. This indicated that it would have been unlikely for her to have accidentally fallen in while walking home and ended up in the location where she was discovered. However, if Janet did not fall into the river, who could have placed her there? As the enigma deepened, residents of Maine began to speculate whether a serial offender might be at large. This was also a line of inquiry that investigators had started to pursue. An hour away, in Jay, Maine, 17-year-old Kimberly Morrow disappeared on May 9th, 1986. She was last seen in the company of someone she had encountered earlier that day. Despite extensive searches throughout the state, law enforcement was unable to determine her fate. No links could be established between Kimberly and Janet's case. Unbeknownst to the investigators, another woman would go missing just 5 months after Janet's body was discovered, and her situation bore striking similarities to Janet's. On August 9th, 1988, 23-year-old Geraldine Finn was enjoying a night out after work with 2 colleagues. She worked as a certified nursing assistant at the Skowhegan Nursing Home. The bar they visited, Pete and Larry's, was located on Upper Main Street in Waterville, just 3 miles from T. Woody's, where Janet was last seen. While Geraldine and her friends were seated by the window, a stranger drove by in a blue Chevy Blazer. He attracted their attention and gestured for the 3 young women to come outside. They complied and approached his vehicle. He then inquired if they would like to go for a swim. However, this request was far from innocent. When they reached his open window, they discovered he was completely nude. He suggested they join him for skinny dipping. Likely unsettled by the encounter, they turned back and returned to the bar to continue their evening. It was still before 8:30 p.m., and the group wished to enjoy more time out before heading home. After a while, the same man returned to the bar, this time fully dressed. As the evening unfolded, he began to engage with Geraldine's group. Perhaps he offered an explanation for their earlier encounter, possibly attributing it to his earlier experience of skinny dipping, which left his clothes damp. Whatever his words were, they succeeded in breaking the ice, leading to interactions between him and Geraldine's friends. By the end of the night, Geraldine felt at ease with him, ultimately accepting his invitation for a ride home. The last sighting of her by her friends was as she settled into the passenger seat of his Chevy. Unbeknownst to them, this would be the last time they would see her alive. The following day, she was reported missing. Her friends informed the authorities about the man who had offered her a ride, describing his blue Chevy Blazer, his notable mustache, and a diamond-shaped tattoo on his shoulder. On August 14th, 1988, 5 days after Geraldine's disappearance, a man walking on a property along Route 201 stumbled upon a grim discovery. In a wooded area he was surveying, he found the body of a young woman. Initially, law enforcement remained discreet about the investigation's details. However, 2 days later, they confirmed that the body was that of Geraldine Finn, indicating that her death was not accidental. She had been murdered. The investigation quickly shifted focus to identifying the man last seen with her. Eventually, they uncovered his identity, a 29-year-old named Gerald Goodale. Goodale was known for his various construction jobs in Waterville. When his name surfaced in connection with Geraldine Finn's case, those familiar with him expressed shock. A family friend remarked on Goodale's helpful nature, always eager to lend a hand. His father also voiced disbelief, insisting that the circumstances did not align with his son's character, asserting that Goodale had an alibi for that night. Goodale's father stated that he had remained at home until 9:45, anticipating a phone call. Following that, he went out for a mud run. It was clear that investigators were skeptical of his account. They were not inclined to accept a family member's testimony, particularly when co-workers who had been with Geraldine that evening indicated that Goodale resembled the last person seen with her. After placing Goodale under police observation, authorities proceeded to arrest him. On August 15th, he was taken into custody and charged with the murder of Geraldine Finn. As news of the arrest spread, reporters began to explore potential links between the cases of Janet and Geraldine. Both women were of similar age, worked in the medical field, and were last seen after social outings with friends in Waterville. They were each last spotted in the parking lots of two bars located just 3 miles apart. The sites where their bodies were discovered also exhibited some parallels. Although Janet was found in the water, the surrounding area was rural and isolated, mirroring the location where Geraldine's body was located. More troubling was the fact that Goodale had confessed to a family member that he had seen Janet Brochu in the parking lot of T. Woody's on the night she disappeared. This admission directly linked him to the case, especially since he had not disclosed this information to authorities, despite their repeated requests. On September 3rd, Goodale attended court for his bail hearing. The state argued that he posed a threat to society and should remain incarcerated until his trial the following year. To support their argument, the state presented several witnesses who testified that Goodale had been questioned regarding Janet's case in the weeks after her disappearance. Their evidence was compelling, leading to Goodale being returned to jail as he awaited his trial in May 1989. The prosecution entered the trial with a strong belief that they would secure a conviction. They presented witness testimony indicating that Goodale was the last person seen with Geraldine, emphasizing his troubling behavior earlier that night. Interestingly, they did not need to establish his guilt, as Goodale confessed to the crime while seeking a reduced sentence. He argued that his actions were not premeditated, claiming he had acted in a moment of panic when Geraldine attempted to flee. However, the prosecution was resolute in their stance against leniency, viewing him as a significant threat who deserved a lengthy prison term. Following a guilty verdict from the judge, Goodale attempted to negotiate a lighter sentence by revealing he had information about Janet Brochu's case, asserting he knew the identity of the true perpetrator. Despite this claim, he was not forthcoming with details, and curiously, he was never publicly identified as a suspect in that investigation. Ultimately, Goodale was sentenced to 75 years in prison, with the possibility of parole not occurring until 2033. As time went on, Janet's family entered the new millennium without any developments in her case. It wasn't until decades later that there was a breakthrough. In 2019, on the 32nd anniversary of Janet's disappearance, a cold case team was assigned to revisit her case. Although her parents had passed away and could not receive this encouraging news, other relatives and friends were filled with renewed hope that justice would eventually be served. Then, on May 14, 2021, the long-awaited moment arrived. An arrest was made at the Maine State Penitentiary, and the individual taken into custody was none other than Gerald Goodale. The catalyst for this significant development in a case that had remained stagnant for so long was DNA evidence. State Police Chief John Coate addressed the situation, stating that this case is the result of years of dedicated collaboration among state, local, and county investigators, prosecutors, and expert scientists who remain steadfast in their commitment to uncovering the truth and seeking justice for the victim, her family, and friends. In March 2023, Gerald Goodale, now in his early 60s, received an additional 32.5 years added to his sentence for his actions against Janet Brochu. Acknowledging the inevitable outcome, Goodale chose not to contest his involvement and instead entered a guilty plea to the charges against him. Although her parents were unable to attend the court proceedings, other family members were present to witness the long-awaited justice for a life taken too soon. Her cousin, Daniel Brochu, reflected on her character, saying, "She was a sweet girl, young, foolish, like the rest of us." It may provide some small comfort to Janet's family that the individual responsible had not been free during those years. He had been incarcerated, albeit for different offenses. The specifics of that fateful night remain undisclosed, and it is likely that some truths will remain with Gerald Goodale forever. Let's explore the narrative of a man abandoned by estranged parents, a tumultuous upbringing, and a flawed law enforcement system. This is the account of a serial killer famously known as the Disturbed Dave. David Edward Maust was born to George and Eva Maust on April 5, 1954, in Connorsville, Pennsylvania. Besides David, the family included 3 other children. The family faced numerous challenges. Both George and Eva had endured difficult childhoods themselves. His father was placed for adoption at the age of 12, leading the parents to struggle in creating a nurturing environment for their own children. George was frequently absent from home, attempting to distance himself from his wife, who demanded constant attention, was emotionally unstable and self-absorbed. Shortly after the birth of David's younger brother Jeffrey, their mother was hospitalized for a month due to a nervous breakdown. It is possible she was suffering from postpartum depression, but during that era there was limited understanding and support for women in such circumstances. In 1963, when David was merely 7 years old, his parents separated. Apparently, the divorce was initiated by David's father, who had ceased supporting his ex-wife and the 4 children for a year, leaving the woman to care for the family alone. David's sister later recounted that life in their parents' household was challenging for all the children, but David faced the toughest circumstances, possibly due to his strong physical resemblance to his father. Since their mother harbored animosity towards her ex-husband, her hatred was projected onto her son. Eva claimed she struggled to manage the boy. Supposedly, by the age of 8, David had made 2 attempts to harm his brother Jeffrey, once by pushing him into the water in a lagoon and preventing him from climbing out by stepping on his fingers, and another time by trying to set Jeffrey's bed on fire. His mother also alleged that she frequently checked her son's pockets for stolen items from others. According to her, he would take her valuable possessions and sell them, supposedly all before he turned 9. However, when he reached the age of 9, Eva made it clear that she no longer wanted to deal with a difficult and troublesome child. She took the matter to court, claiming that he was mentally ill and in need of help. As a result, the 9-year-old child was admitted to a mental institution. However, the staff and doctors at the institution observed no signs of the behavior described by Eva. Instead, they concluded that the mother had simply abandoned her son. If life at home was already challenging for the boy, it became even worse in the institution. He had to share common spaces with numerous other individuals, including patients with schizophrenia, developmental disorders, and aggressive criminals. David felt a mix of anger and confusion. He believed he had nowhere to turn since both his father and mother had abandoned him, leaving him feeling trapped. On visitation days, he would stand by the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of his mother, who never showed up. The institution staff tried to console him, offering excuses for his mother's absence, claiming she was unwell or had other reasons for not being there. Over time, the boy accepted his situation. He and the other children simply imagined that their parents needed a break and hadn't truly abandoned them. While this may not have been the case for David, it held some truth for other children in similar situations. During those times, institutions like these were unfortunately used to essentially abandon children. David later recalled another boy who would spend summers at the clinic because his parents treated it as a summer camp while they went on vacation, using it as a way to leave their child behind. Miraculously, when they returned from their vacation, their son miraculously recovered from his supposed mental illness. The doctors quickly recognized David's intelligence. He consistently expressed his thoughts clearly and showcased exceptional abilities, particularly in recalling sporting events. Due to these circumstances, the medical staff quickly suspected that it was Eva, David's mother, who was suffering from a mental disorder rather than her son. They patiently waited for her recovery so they could send David back home. However, each time they attempted to arrange for the child's return, his mother rejected him. When David reached the age of 13, the clinic staff had no choice but to officially acknowledge that he did not have any mental abnormalities. Nevertheless, he still had nowhere to go. Consequently, he was transferred to a nearby children's home, just a few blocks away from his family's residence. It must have been incredibly painful for him to realize that his relatives lived close by, but wanted nothing to do with him. However, David found solace in the shelter, surrounded by other boys going through adolescence. Since they lacked interaction with the opposite sex, it was only natural for them to explore relationships with one another. As soon as David arrived at the children's home, another boy began demanding his attention. This boy was persistent and resorted to blackmail, threatening to expose David's stay in the mental institution. David initially resisted, but later confessed in his diary that he gave in and kissed the young blackmailer. However, he immediately felt disgust and anger towards himself. Apart from this incident, David adapted well to life in the shelter. Despite the hardships he endured during his difficult childhood, time in the clinic, and stay at the shelter, his ability to learn remained unaffected. He maintained his concentration and impressed others with his exceptional memory. Life seemed to be improving until a sudden surge of rage began to awaken within him. By the age of 15, David assaulted another boy named Eddie. They were playing together when, for unknown reasons, David began choking Eddie. Eddie was on the brink of death, but David abruptly stopped upon realizing that Eddie was struggling to breathe. He sincerely asked for forgiveness, and Eddie forgave him. The question remains, was this repentance genuine? David's intentions and emotions during the incident remain unclear, as he may not have sought trouble because he had no other place to go and was struggling to control himself. However, we have knowledge of this event because he documented it in his 87-page prison diary. Despite his initial attempt at self-control, David's restraint did not last long. He made another disturbing move when he tried to strangle another boy named Daniel. The two were simply watching TV together in a room when David suddenly grabbed a rope and wrapped it around Daniel's neck. However, he quickly stopped when he realized that Daniel had done nothing wrong to him. In his diary, David wrote, "I told myself enough, released the rope, and Daniel fell to the floor." He described feeling trapped within himself, as if someone else was trying to harm Daniel, and he couldn't stop it. David contemplated his actions and tried to convince himself that they were wrong. He began to believe that he had no control over his actions or thoughts, which must have been terrifying for a teenager who lacked a normal parental figure in his life. Although Daniel survived the incident, he reported it, leading to David being sent back to the institution for the mentally ill. There seemed to be a glimmer of hope when David turned 17. He and a few other boys managed to escape from the clinic and decided to return home. However, his hopes were shattered when he discovered that Eva, his mother, had gotten married and had no place for him in her life. To make matters worse, she publicly denounced David as a disgrace to the family and even denied his existence. In order to get rid of him, she convinced him to join the army. It is important to note that this occurred in 1971 during the Vietnam War. Despite the circumstances, joining the army may not have been the worst option for David. It provided him with a purpose, a place to live, and valuable skills. His mother sent him to the recruiter to give him something to do with his life. David was accepted into the army and stationed in Frankfurt, Germany. He worked as a cook at a military base where civilians, including a 13-year-old boy named James McClister, also resided. James, who was known as Jimmy, had parents who worked as engineers on the base. David and Jimmy crossed paths at the Army's bowling alley. David discovered a new talent. He excelled at playing bowling, participated in competitions, and earned a decent income from it. David and Jimmy became close friends and spent a lot of time together. However, one evening, David woke up in his bed to find himself naked next to Jimmy. This infuriated David, and in his anger, he suggested that they go for a ride on a moped. Jimmy, trusting David completely and considering him an older brother figure, fearlessly agreed. Little did Jimmy know what David had in mind. They drove far away from their usual surroundings and arrived at a place where a crater from a World War II bomb remained. It was there that David tied Jimmy to a tree and mercilessly beat him with a plank he found nearby. Tragically, Jimmy lost his life during this brutal assault. David callously untied the lifeless body and left it there. Upon returning to their base, David pretended as if nothing had happened. Although a search was conducted for Jimmy, he was only found a month later. David was apprehended, but somehow managed to convince the court that it was an unfortunate accident. He claimed that the boys had damaged the moped, leading to Jimmy's fatal crash. David, overwhelmed with fear and confusion, hid Jimmy's body. His story was believed, as there was no concrete evidence of murder, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Interestingly, David's behavior in prison was impeccable. He earned a diploma, maintained regular correspondence with his family, and acquired new skills that would prove useful in the future. His exemplary conduct led to him being considered for early release on parole, but he declined the opportunity. David had come to realize the depths of his capabilities and was terrified of being set free. The confines of prison provided him ample time for introspection, and he acknowledged that if released, he would undoubtedly take another life. He despised himself for these thoughts and emotions as they filled him with disgust. His lawyer later referred to him as one of the most remarkable serial killers due to his conscience. David genuinely felt remorse for his actions, even up until the moment he committed murder again. He loathed himself for the atrocities he had committed. However, the craving for murder resurfaced, leading him to give in to it once more. This behavior is quite unusual. Nonetheless, he was released in 1977 upon turning 23 years old. 2 years later, he relocated to Chicago and formed a friendship with a teenage boy. While it appeared to be a friendship, there were moments when David felt the urge to harm him. One night, after they had been drinking and the teenager had fallen asleep on the couch, David succumbed to this irresistible impulse. He used a knife to stab the boy in the abdomen, nearly disemboweling him, but the teenager survived. David was charged with attempted murder. During his testimony, he lied and was ultimately acquitted. The reason behind his convincing lies remains a mystery. Perhaps he possessed a talent for being persuasively deceitful when necessary. By the age of 27, David had not managed to control his impulses. In an effort to comprehend his actions, he recalled a traumatic incident at the orphanage involving a boy who had kissed him. He theorized that this negative experience was the root cause of his violent behavior. Consequently, he resolved to locate that boy, now a man, and end his life. David believed that by doing so, he could put an end to his destructive tendencies. Thus, he embarked on a mission to direct his anger towards this man. However, upon reaching the man's former residence, he discovered that the man was incarcerated. David was not the only one from the orphanage who had encountered trouble after leaving. Unable to confront his abuser or suppress his murderous urges, he came across a 15-year-old boy named Donald Jones, who was completely innocent and happened to be passing by his car at the wrong time. David persuaded the teenager to enter his car under the pretense of a simple odd job and drove him to a secluded area with quarries, reminiscent of his previous victim. He proceeded to stab Donald multiple times in the abdomen. Later, in his journal, he documented the boy's desperate pleas for mercy, repeatedly uttering the words, "Please spare me. I'm just 15 years old." However, David found himself unable to resist his dark impulses. He proceeded to lead the teenager to the waterlogged section of the quarry, leaving him there to meet his tragic fate. Trapped and helpless, the young boy met his untimely demise. David made the decision not to wait for the discovery of the body and promptly left the town. He was aware that his uncle resided in Galveston, Texas, and sought refuge with him. His uncle graciously offered him shelter and secured employment for him in his construction company. Once again, David showcased his exceptional work ethic, but unfortunately, his employment was terminated when he accidentally damaged the company's van. Matters took a turn for the worse. He lured a 14-year-old boy to his hotel room, initially offering him alcohol and illicit substances, only to subject him to a brutal assault. Suddenly, a moment of clarity washed over him, and the remorseful David halted his heinous actions. He dropped the weapon and succumbed to tears, overwhelmed by shame. Miraculously, the boy survived, while David received a 5-year prison sentence. During his time behind bars, he contemplated the possibility of continuing his murderous spree upon release. Investigators began to establish connections between him and the Donald Jones case, leading to his extradition to Chicago in 1982. Initially deemed unfit to stand trial, he was subsequently returned to a psychiatric clinic. However, after enduring a decade of awaiting trial, David finally confessed his guilt in 1994. As a result, he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The Cook County prosecutor submitted a report to the Illinois Department of Corrections, labeling him as the most dangerous inmate they had encountered. The sheriff even likened him to the notorious criminal John Wayne Gacy. Nevertheless, due to the extensive duration of David's trial and extradition process spanning 12 years, his sentence was reduced by 12 years. Furthermore, owing to his exemplary conduct as a prisoner, an additional 2 years were deducted from his remaining sentence. David expressed his strong desire to remain in prison by writing a detailed 6-page letter to the Illinois Department of Corrections. In this letter, he openly admitted his inability to control his actions and explicitly stated his preference to stay incarcerated. He even went as far as requesting not to be released. During that period, Illinois had a law that allowed convicted individuals to voluntarily choose a lifelong imprisonment as a sexually violent offender. David was presented with this option and eagerly agreed to it, urging the authorities to bring the necessary paperwork for him to sign. Unfortunately, his plea seemed to have fallen on deaf ears as nobody responded to his request. Consequently, in 1999, he was released from custody. Following his release, David relocated to Oak Park, Illinois, hoping that a change of environment would provide him with a fresh start. However, his hopes were shattered when, merely a year later, he viciously attacked his friend, Anthony, by striking him on the back of the head with a metal pipe. Despite the severity of this assault, the police did not take substantial action against David. Surprisingly, no charges were filed against him, primarily because Anthony, a former gang member, chose not to involve law enforcement and refused to testify against David. In 2002, after completing his parole, David decided to move once again, this time to Hammond, Indiana. He secured a job in close proximity to teenagers, a fact that should have raised concerns given his history of victimizing young individuals. Employers at that time had the ability to conduct background checks on potential employees, yet David was inexplicably allowed to work alongside young boys. He swiftly resumed his predatory behavior, frequenting places where teenagers gathered, such as public pools. Under the guise of offering simple tasks, he enticed the boys with the promise of earning money. Understandably, no teenager would decline such an opportunity. However, these seemingly innocent tasks turned out to be sinister in nature. This pattern persisted until the alarming disappearance of Michael Dennis, a 13-year-old, and James Regagni, a 16-year-old. David encountered these boys during the summer at the public pool and formed a friendship with them, extending an invitation for them to visit his home. The boys were last seen on September 10, 2003. Initially, the police speculated that they may have run away, especially considering Michael and James's rebellious nature. Consequently, the disappearance of these two boys did not receive as much attention as the disappearance of 19-year-old Nick James on May 2, 2003. Unlike Michael and James, Nick James was not rebellious, and his family had been pressuring the police for several months. Investigators discovered that he worked at a store alongside David Maust and conducted a background check on him. Despite lacking evidence, they requested David to undergo a polygraph test, which he successfully passed. David stated that he hadn't seen the boys in a while, which was essentially true. However, the investigators did not inquire about his involvement in their disappearance. Despite David passing the polygraph test, the investigators decided to search his residence. In 2003, an officer with an emo trained to locate bodies was brought in for the search. The police invited the dog and its handler to search David Maust's basement. When the officer commanded emo, the dog began barking at the far wall of the basement. This behavior was peculiar as it contradicted the dog's training, which involved acting as if it were digging. However, breaking the concrete and investigating what lay behind it became necessary, as there seemed to be a reason why the dog refused to leave that specific spot. A week later, the police were requested to return to the same house. Officers drilled a deep hole in the floor but found nothing. They then moved to another area, drilling a longer hole, yet still found nothing. Consequently, they abandoned the search. They subsequently requested the return of the dog for further investigation. Emo immediately approached the hole and lay down this time. The officer was unable to capture this on video and requested the handler to command the dog once again. Subsequently, the dog proceeded to another hole and laid down once more. The police called in a concrete specialist and discovered that David had utilized a significant amount of concrete, approximately 80 bags or so. Evidently, this was done with the intention of concealing something, presumably bodies. Eventually, the police removed the concrete and uncovered 3 bodies. James and Michael had been suffocated by David in his apartment and buried beneath the basement alongside Nick. Suddenly, David's mother and brother, who had not been in contact with him for many years, made an appearance. Jeffrey conducted numerous interviews, questioning whether the police could have prevented what had occurred if they had paid attention to David earlier. He spoke of terrible things that his brother allegedly did during their childhood, but lacked any evidence. Furthermore, his mother and brother, who had not communicated with David for many years, appeared to have a thirst for fame, with Jeffrey even expressing a desire to write a book. David's attorney, Thomas Wayne, affirmed that he was indeed a serial killer, but not one by birth. The attorney genuinely believed that if one were to seek the recipe for creating a serial killer, David's childhood would precisely fit the bill. He never acquired the skills to function in society or engage with others. In November 2005, David pleaded guilty to the murders and received a sentence of 3 life imprisonments. In January 2006, at the age of 51, David passed away. A note was discovered in his cell where he confessed to 5 murders, including 3 in Hammond. He expressed his disappointment at not receiving the death penalty, as he believed he deserved it. He firmly believed that if he had been kept away from society, he would not have committed as many crimes as he did. Additionally, he did not want taxpayers to bear the burden of his existence. He sought forgiveness from the families of the victims and took full responsibility for his actions. He did not place blame on his parents or upbringing, but solely on himself. David expressed his deep affection for his family, yet they never returned the same sentiment.